Okay, now in the final part of our lecture for week 2, okay, this should be week 2, part 3, we're going to talk about elasticity. Okay, elasticity is a neat concept. It helps us when we're determining the shapes of supply and demand curves. Okay, at its very core, okay, just the easiest way to explain elasticity. The easiest way to think about elasticity, because there's many different types of them. There's, say, 300 different types of elasticity, okay? The easiest way to think about what is elasticity. Elasticity is how much one variable changes when another variable changes first, okay? So in other words, if you want to think about an easy example, how much extra gasoline do you buy for your car when the price of gas goes up 10 cents? Okay? That's what elasticity is. The price has gone up. That's the first variable that's changing. The price is going up. And then how much gas do you buy? What is your quantity demanded of gasoline now that the price has gone up 10 cents, okay? That would be how much does one variable change when another variable changes first. Now, obviously, that's just for gasoline. I mentioned that there's 300, 400, 500 different types of elasticity, and that's true. The one we just discussed, how much more gas do you buy when the price goes up, or how much less do you buy when the price goes up 10 cents, that would be an example of what we call the price elasticity of demand. Okay? Let's just get this string out of the way. Or not. There we go. Okay, so that's an example of the price elasticity of demand. Okay, one example would be how much extra gas do you buy when the price goes down. Another would be the price of steak goes down. How much extra steak are you going to eat for dinner? Pizza, coffee, things like that. What we're fundamentally looking at here is how much does your demand change, specifically your quantity demand, change when the price changes first. So the price changes first, and then the demand changes, okay? So that's one example of an elasticity. Another example of an elasticity would be the income elasticity of demand. How much does your quantity demand change when your income changes, okay? So, or how much does your demand change when your income changes? So let's say your income doubles. Well, how much does your demand for a particular good go up, right? That would be the income elasticity of demand. And then there's tons of other ones. Say the interest elasticity of investment. That would be how much does investment change when the interest rate goes up or down. Okay, that would be the interest elasticity of investment. Supply. I've been mentioning all demand stuff so far in this lesson. There's also supply elasticities, right? There's the you could have the price elasticity of supply. Okay, how much does the quantity supplied of a particular good or service go up when the price goes up or down? You could have the income elasticity of supply. How much less do firms produce when national income goes up or down? Okay? So those are all examples of elasticity. Formally, the way you would calculate the price elasticity of demand, okay, it's the percent change. You know, I hope you know what this triangle means. It means change. It's Greek. It means delta. It's the rate of change. Okay? So the percent change of a quantity, and for demand, this would be quantity demanded. What's the percent change of quantity demanded divided by the percent change of a price. Okay? So if, let's say, the percent change of quantity demanded was 10% and the percent change of a price was 5%, then your elasticity would be 2. Okay? The price elasticity of demand for some good or service would be 2. Okay? Well, how do we interpret that? Okay? What does 2 mean? We can, in fact, categorize 5 different types of elasticity. Okay? In reality, there's basically 2 of them. That's the way, at least, I'm going to refer to them in this class. But there are 5 of them. Okay? Okay, now these are the 5 types, which I'll just do this for briefly. These are the 5 different types of elasticity. There's perfectly inelastic, inelastic, unitary elastic, elastic, and perfectly elastic. Okay? And I'm going to draw out the shapes of all of these as well. If, for example, you were to calculate the price elasticity of demand, the way we just did, let's say that the numerator was 10%, the denominator was 5%, so that means your elasticity is 2. Okay, what does that mean? It means that it would be considered elastic. Okay? Now, let me give you some examples of each of these, and then we can start talking about, which your book also has as well. And then I'll discuss where the shape of the demand or the supply curve comes from with that. Okay? So, these are the 2 that people take the most seriously: inelastic and elastic. Okay? If something has an inelastic demand, what you're basically saying is that I don't really care how much the price goes up or down, I'm still going to purchase the same quantity of it. So what would be one example of that? Gasoline. Okay? Another would be water. Right? Another one would be eggs or bread, milk, right? The necessaries of life, okay? Heat in the wintertime, okay? So you can basically think of inelastic products as the necessaries for life, okay? It's things you really can't live without. No matter what the price goes up or down to, you're going to buy the same quantity, okay? So we can diagram that demand curve like this. And this is ultimately what we're getting at in this final part of the lecture, is we're trying to look at the different shapes our supply and demand curves can take on, and what that tells us about supply and demand analysis. Okay? So as I mentioned, if you have an inelastic demand curve, let's take gas for example, right? Gas is inelastic. Okay? No matter what the price, you're more or less going to buy the same quantity. I mean, if you remember, if you were old enough to drive, back in 2007, 2008, the price of gas went up a lot during the summer, as it typically does. Okay? And it wasn't so much the level, but gas prices were going up very, very quickly. Okay? So you would think normal, neoclassical economics says, well, if the price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. Well, that's not necessarily true, right? The price went up very rapidly. Okay, say it was going up 3 to 5% each week, so that by the end of the summer it had gone up, $1.25, $1.50 from where you started. People, especially Americans, love to drive. We drive everywhere. Okay, so no matter what the price, maybe not particularly in the Northeast because we have so much public transportation, but in the rest of the country, Americans drive, right? What's the American dream? It's the Corvette in the driveway, right? It's a car, okay? So, what you end up getting, okay, is if what we saw is that the price went up a lot, but the quantity demanded of gasoline more or less stayed the same. Some people started carpooling together, some started taking public transit, but for the most part, people just kept on driving, right? They complained about how much they had to pay to fill up their SUVs, but they still kept doing it, okay? So the quantity demanded was the same. We can diagram that with 2 points, okay? Let's say that there is a big increase in price, okay? That's a fairly large increase of price, which I'll label as P0, P1, okay? It's a very large increase of price, but with gasoline, no matter how much the price goes up, Americans just keep on driving, okay? So, despite the fact that the price went up a lot, the quantity only went down a little bit, right? Some people decided to take the bus, some people started carpooling, but for the most part, everyone just kept on driving. Okay? So here we also have Q0 and Q1. Okay? So despite the fact that there was a large increase in price, there was a small drop in quantity demanded. Okay? We can diagram that like this. Let's just make 2 points, P0, Q0. P1, Q1. Now let's just connect the dots to see what that demand curve would look like. It's not perfectly straight, but it'll do. That would be a demand curve. Specifically, that is an inelastic demand curve. Okay? By inelastic, we're saying that when the price goes up a lot, the quantity demanded goes down only a little bit. Or conversely, when the price goes down a lot, the quantity demanded only goes up a little bit, right? If the price of gas was to go from whatever it is now, say $3.30, right? If the price of gas went from $3.30 to $1, are people going to suddenly start driving across the country? No, you're going to love the fact that gas is cheaper, but you're still going to buy the same amount, right? You only have to go from your house to work, go see your friends, etc., and you require that amount of fuel. You're not going to suddenly start driving to, Ohio or Florida simply because gas is cheaper, okay? So if the price was to go down a lot, you wouldn't really buy that much more gas, okay? So this is an inelastic demand curve, okay? This is what we can refer to as an inelastic demand curve. Certain things that have inelastic demand curves, like I mentioned, gasoline, alcohol, right? For alcoholics would have that. Tobacco users, things with addiction, right? Or the basic necessaries of life, you know, food, clothing, shelter. Okay? Those have inelastic demands. Okay? So, how would we tell if we had an inelastic demand? Well, if we happen to be doing a price elasticity of demand, which our formula was this, if we did a price elasticity of demand, if we actually calculated out percent change of quantity demanded divided by the percent change of price, okay, how much quantity demanded changes when price changes, if it came out to be less than 1, right, if we reverse my example from before, if the quantity demanded changed 5% when the price changed 10%, so 5 divided by 10 would be 1/2. 1/2 is less than 1. Okay? If that was to happen, we have 1/2 here, it's less than 1, then we would have an inelastic demand curve. Okay? So our demand curve would look like that. Now, there's the second major type, okay, of elasticity. We've gone over inelastic. Now let's talk about the second major type, which is elastic. Okay? Let's talk about an elastic demand curve. With an elastic demand curve, we're talking about products that are sort of luxuries, if you will, or things you don't always buy. Let's say going out to dinner, or bananas, right? If the price of bananas goes down, ooh, I'll get bananas instead of, you know, apples or strawberries, something like that. Air travel, right? If the price of airfares goes down just a little bit, people actually start taking more travel trips. Okay? And there's other examples in your book as well. That we don't, you know, just, you're going to read the chapters anyway. So those are elastic demands, examples of goods and services that have elastic demands. At its core, an elastic demand is when the price changes a little bit and the quantity changes a lot. Okay? So, let's take going out to eat. Let's take restaurant dinners, right? For $15 a plate, maybe you're not going to go out to dinner, right? Like $15 a plate, that's, if we each have 2 drinks, $15, it's going to be like a $70, $80 bill. Most people don't do that. $80 just for a night out, you know, we could stay in and eat instead. On the other hand, if the price went down to, say, $10 a meal, which is really only a difference of $5, it turns out that a lot more people actually go out to eat. Okay? So by dropping the price just a little bit, the quantity demanded has gone up a lot. So let's graph that. We have price 0, price 1. Okay? Just a little bit, the price has fallen. But here, we have a huge increase in quantity demanded. Okay, so as with inelastic demands, now let's try to graph an elastic demand curve. Okay? So an elastic demand curve, we connect the dots, looks like that. Okay? So now let's compare the two situations. An inelastic demand curve was a lot more vertical, right? I'll even label it like this. I'm making E for elastic, and then I'm going to write I for inelastic. Okay? These are both demand curves, but they have different shapes. Just like I said at the top of this part, right, of part 3 of week 2, at the top of this lecture, that what we're really doing with elasticity is we're trying to figure out the shapes of the supply and demand curves. Okay? So, if you had an elastic demand curve, it's very horizontal. Okay? It's horizontal. On the other hand, if you had an inelastic demand curve, then it would be much more vertical. Okay? So, those are the two big elasticity concepts, okay? There's inelastic and there's elastic, okay? Now, I have 3 others up here, okay? Perfectly inelastic, unitary elastic, and perfectly elastic. Okay, so Devin, if you're telling us that there's only 2 big concepts, then why in the world are there 5 up there? Okay? These 3, perfectly inelastic, unitary elastic, and perfectly elastic, those 3 are sort of logical outcomes from the concepts of inelastic or elastic. Okay? I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Let's just erase the diagram here. Okay. Now I'm going to draw an inelastic demand curve. And I'll make an I for demand inelastic. Okay? Demand inelastic. Well, okay, we saw that an elastic demand curve is horizontal, more or less, it's fairly horizontal. And, excuse me, an inelastic demand curve is quite vertical, okay? Well, these 3 are logical outgrowths of the changing shape, okay? We were fairly horizontal, now we're fairly vertical. Well, what happens, right? You sort of had to do a theoretical exercise. What happens if you run this formula, right? If, let's say, the percent change of quantity demand was none, right? But the price changed 10%, right? So gas prices went down 10%, but the quantity demanded did not change at all. It was exactly the same, okay? Well, that would be 0 divided by 10%. 0 divided by anything is 0, okay? That would be 0, which is a perfectly inelastic demand curve, okay? So, we had an elastic, which was horizontal, then we were getting inelastic, which I have up here, and a perfectly inelastic demand curve is exactly vertical, okay? That's demand curve, perfectly inelastic, okay? What do I mean by that? Well, what I'm saying is, think about the gasoline example again, okay? No matter how much the price changed, right? Let's say the price went from here to here. So the price went all the way up. In fact, the price could go to infinity. It could be 0 or it could be infinity. No matter what, the quantity is exactly the same. Okay? That's what a perfectly inelastic demand curve is. No matter what the price, the quantity is exactly the same. okay? It's slightly different from an inelastic demand curve, right? With an inelastic, the price goes up or down a lot, but the quantity changes. It changes slightly, but the quantity changes. Now, if something is perfectly inelastic, what we're saying is that the price has gone from 0 to infinity and back again, but the quantity demanded is exactly the same. Nothing has changed, okay? In reality, I mentioned this is sort of a logical outcome, right? There really is nothing where the price goes from 0 to infinity and back again, where the quantity demanded is exactly the same. Some of my students laugh at this one. The only thing I could really think of, there's two I could think of, right? Oxygen, if we started charging people for oxygen, right? You would pay, if it was free, which it is now, then you still demand the same quantity of oxygen, right? Or if the price went up to infinity, right? If the price was $1 million per oxygen tank, you're going to try to come up with a way to get $1 million so you can keep breathing, right? Like I said, these are sort of nuanced examples because it's a logical outcome. There's not a lot of things that are perfectly inelastic, okay? The second one is crack, for crackheads, okay? Some people laugh at that one too. All I'm saying is, and we don't need to talk about the drug trade and things like that, I'm just saying, it doesn't really matter if the price is 50 cents or $100 for crack, right? If you're a crackhead, you demand the same amount of crack, right? Or else you're quite unhappy, okay? The point being, nothing is really perfectly inelastic, okay, except for maybe those two examples. What's really of concern is that you understand what inelastic is, okay? Later on in the course, you will have to know about perfectly inelastic versus inelastic, things like that, which is why I'm covering it. But for now, the major thing to remember is simply the difference between inelastic and elastic. Okay? Elastic is horizontal, inelastic is vertical. Okay? So, I'm going to erase the perfectly inelastic demand curve now. So now I'm also going to draw an inelastic demand curve. Demand inelastic. And I'm going to redraw the elastic demand curve. Okay? So we have an inelastic, which is pretty vertical, and we have an elastic, which is fairly horizontal. Okay? In between, transitioning between the two, right, an inelastic has a value that is less than 1. Okay, so an inelastic demand has a value that's less than 1, whereas an elastic demand has a value that's greater than 1. Okay, well, if that big one is less than 1, this big concept, right? If the big concept of inelastic is less than 1, and this other big concept of elastic is greater than 1, logically, in the middle, there has to be something that is equal to 1. Okay? We need to name it. We need to name the elasticity when something is exactly 1. Okay? Why? This is less than 1. This is greater than 1. What are we going to call it if this formula turns out to be exactly 1? Right? If it turns out to be equal to 1. So, that's what we call unitary elastic. Unitary for 1, right? Unitary elastic. So that would be right in the middle. I'm just writing du for demand unitary, okay? So if you had an inelastic demand curve, and I hope this isn't getting too messy for you, But if this was an inelastic demand curve, which is fairly vertical, and in the process of shifting to an elastic demand curve, right? So inelastic to elastic, at some point, that formula will be exactly equal to 1, right? As it switches there, right? That is exactly equal to 1. So we're going to call that a unitary elastic demand curve. It's simply when this formula comes out to be 1. Okay? So those are the 2 special cases so far. There's 3 we have to go through. We've talked about inelastic demand, elastic demand, and then we talked about perfectly inelastic, unitary inelastic. Lastly, we have to talk about perfectly elastic. Okay, a perfectly elastic demand curve. Well, let's backtrack for a second. And if you want to recall, an elastic demand is when the price changes a little and the quantity changes a lot. Okay? So the price changes a little, quantity changes a lot. So it's a very horizontal, it's fairly horizontal as a demand curve. Okay? It's a fairly horizontal one. Well, we had perfectly inelastic, which was vertical, and then we have an inelastic, which is fairly vertical. It's not perfectly, but it's pretty vertical. Then we have a unitary elastic, which is just exactly 1. It's directly in between inelastic and elastic. So perfectly inelastic, inelastic, unitary, elastic. It follows that the last one is going to be perfectly horizontal. Okay, it'll be exactly horizontal. And what we're going to be saying in there, with a perfectly elastic demand curve, is that if there's any change in price whatsoever, all of the demand will vanish. Okay? And you can sort of see it right here. This is still elastic. It's not perfectly inelastic. But if the price was to go from here to here, right? If that was just a small increase of price, the quantity goes from here all the way to there. Okay, so if restaurant meals went from $10 to $12, suddenly no one goes out to a meal anymore. Okay? If it was perfectly elastic, then what you would have is something more like this. And this is always the hardest one for students to see, so it's okay if you just memorize it, you know. It's perfectly horizontal. A perfectly elastic demand curve is exactly horizontal, which means that if the price goes up at all, okay, I shouldn't even put it there. Leave it here. If the price goes from here to here, which is a tiny increase of price, right? It's only a ½ inch on the board. If the price goes up slightly, the quantity goes all the way from here to 0. Okay? And in fact, that's what a perfectly elastic demand curve is. It's when, if there's a slight change in price, even 1 cent, a ½ cent, okay? If the price goes up slightly, the whole demand collapses. Okay? On the other hand, what it's saying is if the price goes down ½ cent, then demand goes from 0 to infinity. Okay? So it's sort of like everyone rushes in if you're getting a bargain, and if you're not getting a bargain, even ever so slightly, everybody just leaves. Okay? That's what perfectly elastic is. And sometimes it helps for students to see it just when I place one over the other. This is an elastic demand curve. Okay. With an elastic demand, there was a small change in price, right? Small change in price, and the quantity had a huge change. Okay? That's an elastic demand. With perfectly elastic, if it just keeps going a little bit more, any change in price, right, even a minuscule change, makes demand go from infinity to zero. Okay? But again, just remember that's sort of a logical construct. When we get to perfect competition, or pure competition, as your book calls it, when we get to that, we're going to find out we're going to have to work with perfectly elastic demand curves. But for now, what I really just wanted you to get down, be introduced to, was inelastic demand and elastic demand, okay? And then the three sort of logical extremes of these concepts, right? If something is super, super duper inelastic, then it's perfectly inelastic. If something is incredibly elastic, then it's perfectly elastic, right? And just logically, when you're on your way from inelastic to elastic, if this is less than 1, this is greater than 1, which means you have to pass through 1, right? You have inelastic, elastic. When you're on your way to it, you have to pass 1. And they decided to name the one that is they decided to name the type of elasticity whose value is 1 unitary elastic. Okay? So far, all we've done is talk about this for demand. Okay? It applies to supply as well. I'm just going to do it very briefly because it's the same concepts. Just reversed around a little bit, but it's nothing too crazy. And for the most part in this class, we're going to work with the demand stuff anyway, the demand elasticities. But if you had a supply curve that was perfectly, or that was inelastic, if you had a supply curve that was inelastic, it would be shaped like that. Okay? It would be very, very upward sloping. Okay? Large change in price, small change in quantity. Okay? On the other hand, if you had a supply that was elastic, okay, then you would have a supply curve shaped like this. Okay? Small change in price, large change in quantity. Okay? And that's really the key to remembering and the way you should think about elasticity. Okay? Inelastic, just think of oil, okay, or gasoline, right? When you think of gasoline, you think of inelastic. The price could change a lot, but there's going to be a tiny change in quantity. Okay? On the other hand, restaurant meals, right? Price changes a little bit, you buy a lot more. Okay? Or even, toothpaste, right? People see the price of toothpaste go down a little bit. It turns out they actually buy a lot more. Can't explain why, but that's what we witness. Okay? We now just have to talk about two effects. Okay? These are going to become pertinent when we study monopoly. Okay? In a couple weeks we're going to look at monopoly, but we need to just talk about it now. when you're looking at demand, okay, let's say you're a producer of Coca-Cola, okay? You want to know if, or let's make it simpler than that. Let's make Coca-Cola elastic, and we'll make tobacco inelastic, because it is, okay? So I've drawn a demand inelastic curve, okay? We're going to start with tobacco. Now, if you are Marlboro, right? You're Philip Morris. You want to know if dropping your price slightly is going to increase your revenue a lot, right? That's what you're interested in. As a business person, you want to know what your demand curve looks like, okay? Well, here, let's just say we drop the price from P0 to P1, okay? P0 to P1. Well, when the price goes down, you're losing money on every sale you make. So if it's gasoline, every time you sell a gallon of gas, you're losing, say, 10 cents if you lower your price from $3.10 to $3, right? You're losing money on every gallon of gas. If you're Philip Morris, you sell a pack of smokes for $5, right? Well, if you lower the price to $4, that means you're losing $1 potentially every time you sell a pack, okay? So, we call that the price effect, okay? The price effect, and this is in your book on page 79 to 81. Okay, it's on page 79 to 81 in your book. Okay, the price effect is how much extra revenue you make if your price goes up, or how much revenue you lose if the price goes down. Okay, so here, if you have an inelastic demand curve, your price effect is quite large. If you go from P0 to P1, the price effect is quite large, right? At the same time, since the price has gone down, you're going to sell more gallons of gas, right? Or more packs of cigarettes, okay? Why? The price has gone down. Now, let's take smoking, because that's an easy one. You're either a smoker or you're not a smoker, okay? So, if the price goes down, smokers will probably buy more packs, right? But there's a whole group out there who are non-smokers who have no interest in becoming smokers, and so therefore they're not just going to go buy, tobacco simply because the price has gone down, right? Ooh, the price of cigarettes went down $1. I would like to get cancer now. So, what you end up having, if you have an inelastic demand, is something we now call the quantity effect. Okay? We have the price effect. The price effect is when the price goes up or down, how much you make or lose based upon the change in price, right? If you sell gas for $3 and then you raise your price to $3.10, well, you're making 10 extra cents per gallon of gas, okay? That's the price effect. The quantity effect is how many fewer gallons of gas you sell, okay? If the price goes from $3 to $3.10 for a gallon of gas, there's some people who are going to choose not to buy as much gasoline, okay? So you're going to lose some sales. That's the quantity effect. The price is measuring how much the price effect measures how much you earn per sale. The quantity effect is measuring how your sales are affected. What's the quantity of your sales? Okay? So now let's go back to the tobacco example. Okay? Philip Morris decides to drop their price a lot. Okay? Well, that's great. Maybe smokers are going to buy a couple more packs here and there. But for the most part, the quantity is going to stay the same. Right? You're either a smoker or you're not. Okay? So, this quantity effect is quite small. This is what the quantity effect would be right here. That's the size of the quantity effect. Okay? The price effect, on the other hand, is quite large. Okay? And that would be it. Okay? So, what we find here is that with an inelastic demand curve, the price effect is larger than the quantity effect. Okay? So if you have an inelastic demand, if you produce something that has an inelastic demand, let's say you produce gasoline, you produce tobacco, right? It's better for your profit to keep a high price, okay, than to lower your, it's better to keep a high price and sell Q0 units rather than lower your price, even a lot, to only sell Q1 units, okay? It's better to keep a high price for your profits if it's gas or tobacco. Why? Well, just think about it, right? Why is gasoline so expensive? Well, because they can charge it, right? Sure, they're going to lose some customers by having a high price of gasoline. They go from P1 to P0, right? Instead of charging $1, you charge $4 per gallon. Sure, some people are not going to drive anymore, but most people still will. So you may lose a couple of customers, but the amount you're going to make per customer, right, per gallon of gas, is going to be far greater. It'll make up for the 3 people who decide not to drive anymore. Okay? So if you have an inelastic demand curve, the price effect is larger than the quantity effect. Okay? Now DE for demand elastic. Okay? On the other hand, if you have an elastic demand curve, okay, the quantity effect is going to outweigh the price effect. How do we know that? Let's just take a look. Let's say we change the price ever so slightly, right? We change it from P0 to P1. Restaurant meals go from $13 a plate to $10 a plate, okay? Not a very big change, right? It's $3 per plate. As it turns out, a lot more people rush in to go to a restaurant if you lower your price just slightly. That's why you always see on these commercials, right? Let's say like Applebee's. You can get a steak and a salad and a dessert, all for $9.99, right? $10 a plate. Well, why aren't they charging $13.99? For $13.99, people decide to not go out. But for $9.99, people say, hey, why not? I'll go out. It's a difference of $4. It's 1 gallon of gas. But for some reason, people continue to buy gas when the price goes up $3, say. But if the price of a restaurant meal goes up $3, suddenly, no, not worth my time. Okay? It's the same cost, but we have different behavior when it comes to gasoline versus dining out. Okay? For an elastic demand curve, there's a small change in price, and if you lower the price just slightly from $14.99 to $9.99, there's a huge increase of quantity. Okay, it goes from Q0 to Q1. Okay, so there's a small change in price, small drop, but a large increase in quantity. That means the quantity effect is quite small. Okay, you used to be able to charge $13.99. Now you're charging $9.99. So per customer, you're losing. What did I say? $13.99, $9.99. So you're losing $3, right? $4. Sorry, you're losing $4. But on the other hand, whereas for $13.99 maybe you had 4 tables full, at $9.99 now there's a wait. Okay, there's a 20-minute wait even to get a table because so many more people decided to come. Okay, so the quantity effect is really big. The amount you're charging each person has gone down, but there's a heck of a lot more people here. Okay? So the quantity effect is much larger than the price effect. Okay? So it's an easy way to remember it. Just for an inelastic demand curve, right? If you have an inelastic, the price effect is greater than the quantity effect. And if you have an elastic demand curve, then the quantity effect is going to be bigger than the price effect. Okay? This, as I mentioned, I wanted to just introduce it now. It's going to come back when we look at monopoly. Okay? But really, for now, what you just need to know, you need to have a grasp of what these 5 are. Okay? You need to know what they are and the shapes of the different curves. Okay, so you have a vertical one that's perfectly inelastic. Then you have one that's fairly vertical, which is inelastic. Then you have one that's exactly equal to 1, that's unitary. Then you have one that's basically horizontal, that's elastic. And then you have one that's perfectly horizontal, which would be perfectly elastic. Okay? So that's going to wrap up our discussion of elasticity now. Okay? So we're done with week 2, and I'm just going to shut the camera off, and you guys feel free to start on your exams.